So to start the review, I'd like to say that I did really like this movie. There are parts of the movie that are brilliant and make for great additions to the Star Wars franchise, but there are also parts of the movie that are so wrong and bad in my mind that it almost takes away from all of the good parts of the movie. So I think the easiest way for me to do this review will just be to break the two parts apart and talk a little bit about the good parts, what was good, why it was good, and then go and talk about the bad parts and why I felt they were so very, very bad. And then we'll see how things end up. So for me, the absolute best part of this movie is the relationship and the interaction between Rey and Kylo Ren, which is great because if the movie had to get one thing right, it was this main story between these two new powerful characters. They both grew at good paces and managed to be something new and different to the Star Wars universe while complementing each other really well and really leaves off as an interesting point to see where they go in the future. It also really helps that both of the actresses and actors, Daisy Ridley and Adam Driver, are spot on excellent and really probably the best new talent they have in this whole franchise and manage to keep their characters really interesting. And it'll be really exciting to see where these two go in the next movie because there are a lot of options and opportunities that this movie really leaves wide open for these two. The other really great thing about this movie is Mark Hamill's return as Luke Skywalker. I've never been a huge fan of this character in the past, but this movie is really all about Luke, and it gives him a moment to shine, maybe unlike anything we've saw in the whole trilogy to date. Mark Hamill proves that he's an excellent actor. He is at the top of his game, and the story for Luke Skywalker in this movie is, for the most part, a very believable and interesting take. I have a few problems with the idea that he would even for a minute think about actually killing his nephew, which is a pretty big plot point. But putting that aside for a minute, the rest of the movie really handles Luke spectacularly well. And it almost seems like a shame that they kill him off at the end because there seemed to be a lot more he could have done in this universe, especially with Carrie Fisher passing away. It would have been interesting to see where he went in the next movie, even though I understand why they went the way they did with him. Also, it was really great to see Yoda come back. That interaction may be one of my favorite scenes of the movie. And then, just to throw in this category as well, the little porg birds on his little island were just used spectacularly well. They didn't go over the line, but they were nice, cute, comic relief, and a really fun addition to the Star Wars world as well. So now on to the bad parts of this movie. For me, maybe one of the worst parts of the whole film are both Poe Dameron and Finn. Their characters are given very little to do here, and what they end up doing just doesn't seem to fit with the story at all. To start with Poe Dameron, we're consistently told that he is the best pilot in the galaxy, and that may be so, but the second he steps out of the X-Wing, all he does are make mistakes. If we think back to the last movie, he was sent to Jakku to get the piece of the map to find Luke. He failed miserably at that task. And in this movie, he consistently proves that he's not a leader at all. The plan that him and Finn cook up to sneak aboard Snoke's ship and get the code so that they can go to light speed without being tracked, that plan completely fails. And in the process, allows the First Order to find out the actual plan, and then they can start targeting the shuttles. If they had just minded their own business, trusted in the leaders that the Resistance had, the Resistance plan would have worked perfectly. So actually, these two made things worse for everybody and cost a ton of lives in this movie. So in no way do either of these two come across as anything borderline heroic. And their whole storyline just seems shoved into the movie to give them an excuse to be here at all, and then to show some new aliens on Canto Bight in the casino. And it just seems really out of place and really distracting, especially when you have a lot of other really interesting characters vying for screen time. These two just stick out as a sore thumb that they had nothing to do in the movie and are really struggling to justify their addition to these movies at all. They're just not really great characters at this point, and I would be really interested to know where they go from here. The second big problem I have with this movie is something I would call character management. And a lot of this has to do with Carrie Fisher's passing away and how much they may or may not have changed the movie as a result of that. She passed away a considerable amount of time before the final film aired, so there was a lot of time that they could have gone back and made changes. And I haven't really heard much, now that the movie's out, about what was or wasn't changed. But just watching it, it doesn't seem like they changed much at all. And that's a real shame, because there were a lot of really great points in this movie that they honestly could have killed Princess Leia, and it would have been a really touching moment. I can think of two scenes off the top of my head that they could have killed her in a very effective, meaningful way, and really handled the passing of Carrie Fisher very well, and done her character justice, and it would have been a sensible plot point for this movie. But instead, the director chooses to just completely overlook the passing of Carrie Fisher, and it seems like he's passed the buck on to the next director and writer to really come up with something unusual and out of the ordinary, when he had a lot of good opportunities in this movie to really handle her death in a good way. So I was really upset and borderline offended that they ignored that whole passing at all. And this may be assuaged down the road if they do have a good plan and it is handled really well in the ninth movie. But right now, I was really unimpressed and unhappy with how they managed Princess Leia in this movie, knowing that Carrie Fisher had passed away. I mean, there's even the scene where she's flying through space, that they're adding things to this character that we're never going to have a chance to follow up on. So it was really seemed, I don't think disrespectful is the right word, but really just didn't do the character justice in the way she should have, given what's happened in the real world. And then in the same vein, they introduce this brilliant new character by Laura Dern, Vice Admiral Holdo, and she has a lot of the same qualities that are really admirable about Leia. She has a new sort of backstory and some mystery to her character, and really seems like a character that you could build into a really interesting role in the ninth film and maybe even in future installments. But instead, they choose to kill her off completely. So it really makes no sense that this writer and director, one and the same person in this movie, choose to add to a character that we know can't go anywhere in Princess Leia, and yet they introduce this brand new interesting character, Holdo, and then kill her off before we hardly get to know her at all. It just seemed like a real mismanagement scenario and makes no sense when you actually stop and think about it. And the final thing that really bothers me about this movie is the fact that writer and director Rian Johnson seems to have no respect for what J.J. Abrams set up in the Force Awakens movie that came before this. There are many, many plot points that are completely thrown away, and in fact, some of the biggest moments of that movie are completely discarded in The Last Jedi in a very haphazard, meaningless way. For instance, the whole ending point of The Force Awakens, when Rey brings Luke the lightsaber, is played off for a joke in this movie, as Luke just casually tosses it over his shoulder and walks on. We're denied that big moment that we'd all been waiting years to see. Um, and then also the big questions that came out of The Force Awakens. The big questions I think most of the internet was asking, who is Supreme Leader Snoke? We are never given any information about him. Instead, he's killed off about midway through the movie. And then on top of that, the other big question, who are Rey's parents, is answered seemingly enough with, oh, they're just nobody. And it seems kind of trivial to be annoyed about that because this is the Star Wars universe. They're allowed to answer those questions how they want to. But for both of those facts to just be completely tossed aside seem like a big disrespect and slap in the face to what was set up in The Force Awakens. And feel really out of place and almost jarringly so in this movie for almost all of the big pop points to just be brushed aside to start this kind of new and different story. I mean, there's even a point where Snoke calls Kylo Ren's mask, I believe, stupid or silly, when in the last movie that was a big defining thing, was that he was wearing a mask like his grandfather. And for the movie in and of itself to kind of bash that whole idea just seemed really wrong. And I can't help but wonder if some of that comes from the fact that Disney did choose to do sort of a round robin type director writer deal where there's not a whole lot of continuity between these two movies, despite some of the names being the same at the executive producer level. Bringing on a whole new team for this movie may not have been the best sense, because if you look at the other trilogy, George Lucas was always had his hand on the helm. He wrote most of those, at least the broad story strokes, himself, and you get a more cohesive narrative that doesn't have these giant cliffhangers left unfulfilled that I feel were riddled through The Last Jedi. And I hope now that we're looking into the next movie with J.J. Abrams coming back on board, that he may be able to smooth over some of these things and make it a more cohesive trilogy, whereas this movie itself feels like a really jarring breakaway from The Force Awakens. So a lot of these negatives may be calmed down and removed when we look at this as a whole movie. But right now there are a lot of unanswered questions or questions answered that just really are a bit of a bummer in the way that they handled these moments. So those are my thoughts on Star Wars The Last Jedi. I know it seems like I talked a lot more about the negatives than the positives, but I really did like this movie. I just think there are a lot of easy areas that it could have been improved to go from a good to great Star Wars movie to being a really impressive, masterful addition to the franchise. I've saw this twice in theaters, and I plan to see it at least once or twice more before it leaves the theaters. It handles these characters for the most part really well. It's always great to see Luke and Leia on the screen, especially knowing that this is the last time we're going to see Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher. And it will be really interesting to hear as we move out from this film how her death really impacted this whole franchise and what they had planned and what they changed. And that may very well change how we view what happened in this movie in terms of what they were or weren't able to do given her passing. So I welcome anybody's comments or thoughts. I hope everyone goes out and sees this movie. It looks like it's already making a ton of money at the box office. So definitely do yourself a favor and don't miss this one. It's definitely well worth seeing.